In May of 2011, in San Juan, Puerto Rico, a phone call went out that almost nobody in America noticed. Robert Traylor, a man they used to call Tractor, was gone. He was 34 years old. The cause, according to reports at the time, was an apparent heart attack. If you followed basketball at all during the late 1990s, you probably recognize that name. Not because of what Robert Traylor accomplished, but because of what he represented. He was the 6th overall pick in the 1998 NBA draft. A lottery selection, a franchise investment, and within just a few years, his name had become shorthand for the worst trade in the history of professional basketball. The man Milwaukee took instead of Dirk Nowitzki. That was the version most people knew. The punchline, the trivia answer, the cautionary tale about how one team got it catastrophically wrong on draft night. And for years, that was enough. Nobody bothered to ask what happened to the other side of the joke. But the full story of Robert Traylor is not a punchline. It is a story about a boy who grew up enormous in one of the toughest cities in America, who was celebrated before he could drive, who carried the weight of expectation and of his own body for his entire adult life. It is a story about scandals, secret payments, federal courtrooms, heart surgery, and a slow, quiet exile from the game he loved, played out on courts in Spain, Turkey, Italy, Mexico, and finally, a Caribbean island thousands of miles from home. Today, we trace every step. But to understand how Robert Traylor ended up dying at 34 in Puerto Rico, we have to go back to where it all started. A tough neighborhood in Detroit, Michigan, where a boy so big they called him Tractor was already turning heads before he was old enough to drive. Robert Deshaun Traylor was born on February the 1st, 1977, in Detroit, Michigan. And if you know anything about Detroit basketball, you know that city doesn't just produce players, it forges them. The playgrounds are ruthless. The competition starts before middle school. The tradition runs deep, and the city has sent more than its share of talent to the highest levels of the game. But even by Detroit standards, Robert Traylor was something different. He was massive. Not just tall, though at 6 feet 9 inches he certainly had height, but genuinely, startlingly enormous. His listed weight was 290 pounds. Contemporaneous reports from his college years placed him well over 300. He wasn't just big the way most basketball players are big. He was big the way a piece of industrial machinery is big. There was a density to him, a gravitational pull. When he moved toward the basket, defenders didn't just get out of the way, they got out of the way, or they got moved. That's where the nickname came from. Tractor. Not because it was clever, because it was accurate. Robert Traylor did not go around people. He went through them. He plowed straight lines to the rim, and whatever was in his path simply ceased to be an obstacle. At Murray Wright High School in Detroit, Traylor became one of the most feared and most recruited players in the entire country. College coaches flew in to watch him play. Scouts scribbled notes about his combination of raw power and surprising agility for a man carrying that kind of weight. He had soft hands around the basket, real footwork in the post, and a meanness on the boards that couldn't be taught. Every major program in America wanted him. And when the invitations went out for the 1995 McDonald's All-American Game, the most prestigious showcase for high school basketball talent in the entire country, Robert Traylor's name was on the list. But wait until you hear who else was invited that same year. The 1995 McDonald's All-American Game featured one of the most extraordinary collections of high school basketball talent ever assembled. Sitting alongside Robert Traylor in that class were names that would go on to define an entire era of the NBA. Kevin Garnett, Vince Carter, Paul Pierce, future Hall of Famers, every one of them, future MVPs, future champions. Players whose jerseys would one day hang from rafters and whose names would be spoken with reverence for decades. And in 1995, Robert "Tractor" Traylor was considered every bit their equal as a prospect. You have to understand what that meant in that era. In the mid-1990s, the NBA still revolved around dominant big men. Centers and power forwards were the most coveted commodity in the sport. A physically overwhelming post player with lottery pick talent was the single most valuable thing a college program or an NBA franchise could acquire. And Traylor checked every box. He was the prototype. He was the dream. He chose the University of Michigan, a program with a storied basketball tradition, still carrying the cultural afterglow of the Fab Five era just a few years earlier. Michigan had swagger. Michigan had a national profile. And Michigan, it seemed, had the perfect stage for a player like Robert Traylor to showcase his dominance and launch himself into the NBA. Robert Traylor arrived at Michigan as one of the most hyped recruits in the country. But behind the scenes, something was already happening. Something involving cash, a booster named Ed Martin, and a secret that would take 6 years to fully unravel. From his very first games in a Michigan uniform, Robert Traylor was exactly what everyone expected him to be: a physically dominant force who could overpower virtually any college big man alive. There is one moment from his time at Michigan that tells you everything you need to know about how he played the game. During a game against Ball State, Traylor went up for a dunk and came down so hard he shattered the backboard. Just broke it. The game had to be stopped so the equipment could be replaced. That was Tractor Traylor in a single image, so powerful that the infrastructure of the sport itself could not contain him. In 1997, Traylor helped lead Michigan to the NIT championship, and he was named the tournament's most valuable player. It wasn't the NCAA tournament, but it was a title, and Traylor was the best player in the entire field. Then came his junior season, 1997 through 98. And this was the year that cemented his draft stock. He averaged 16.2 points and 10.1 rebounds per game. Double-double numbers, night after night, against Big Ten competition. He led Michigan to the inaugural Big Ten tournament title, adding another trophy to a resume that was rapidly becoming impossible to ignore. 16 points, 10 rebounds a game, a broken backboard, 2 tournament trophies, and a body that looked like it was built to dominate the NBA for a decade. Everything was pointing toward draft night glory. But there was a shadow hanging over the Michigan program that hadn't been revealed yet. One that would eventually erase nearly every record Robert Traylor had set, strip him of both those MVP awards, and expose a scandal that reached all the way to a federal courtroom. The scandal began, as scandals so often do, with something that seemed completely unrelated. During Robert Traylor's freshman year at Michigan, he was involved in a car accident. He broke his arm. A routine investigation into the circumstances of that accident triggered something much larger: a 6-year probe into the Michigan basketball program that would eventually become one of the most damaging booster scandals in the history of college sports. At the center of it all was a man named Ed Martin. Martin was a booster, a figure who orbited the Michigan program, attended games, cultivated relationships with players and their families. What investigators would eventually uncover was that Martin had been funneling large sums of money to Michigan players for years. In 2002, Ed Martin pleaded guilty to money laundering conspiracy. According to federal prosecutors, Martin told authorities he had given a combined $616,000 in loans, derived from gambling proceeds, to 4 Michigan basketball players. Robert Traylor was one of them. Chris Webber, the most famous of the Fab Five, was another. The fallout was devastating. the NCAA imposed severe sanctions. Michigan vacated every single game record in which Traylor played. The university withdrew from the 2003 NCAA tournament. Scholarships were stripped, and Robert Traylor was required to forfeit both of his postseason awards, the 1997 NIT MVP and the 1998 Big Ten Tournament MVP. The trophies, the records, the statistical achievements, all of it officially erased. Years later, in January of 2007, according to reports from ESPN, Traylor himself pleaded guilty to tax evasion in connection with the case. That September, he was sentenced to 3 years of probation. His college records were being erased, but by the time those sanctions came down, Robert Traylor had already been in the NBA for years. And his draft night, June the 24th, 1998, would become the single most defining moment of his entire life, for reasons he never could have predicted. June the 24th, 1998. Vancouver's General Motors Place. The NBA Draft. This was a loaded class, arguably one of the deepest in league history. Michael Olowokandi went first overall to the Los Angeles Clippers. Mike Bibby went second to Vancouver. Ref Lafarge third. Anton Jameson fourth. Vince Carter fifth. And then, with the 6th pick in the draft, the Dallas Mavericks selected Robert "Tractor" Traylor out of the University of Michigan, 6th overall, top 10. For a kid who grew up in one of Detroit's toughest neighborhoods, who had bulldozed his way through the Big Ten, who had shattered a backboard and collected 2 tournament MVP trophies, even if those trophies would later be taken away, this was the moment, the payoff, the validation. When your name gets called in the lottery, the arena applauds, your family screams. You shake the commissioner's hand, hold up the cap, and for a few seconds, everything you ever dreamed about becomes real. Robert Traylor experienced all of that on June the 24th. He heard his name echo through that building, and he walked to that stage carrying 300 pounds and a lifetime of ambition. But something was wrong. Almost immediately, whispers started moving through the arena floor. Reporters checking their phones, executives leaning into conversations behind cupped hands. The Dallas Mavericks, it turned out, had no intention of ever putting Robert Traylor in their uniform. Before he even sat back down, the framework of a deal was already in place. Dallas had selected him 6th overall. But they had no intention of keeping him, because 3 picks later, at number 9, a lanky, largely unknown teenager from Würzburg, Germany, was about to change the entire trajectory of NBA history and seal Robert Traylor's fate forever. The deal was announced almost immediately. The Dallas Mavericks traded the rights to Robert Traylor to the Milwaukee Bucks. In return, Dallas received Pat Garrity, a forward out of Notre Dame whom Milwaukee had selected, and the rights to Dirk Nowitzki, a 19-year-old German prospect the Mavericks had taken 9th overall. On paper at the time, this did not look insane. You have to remember, in 1998, international players were still viewed with enormous skepticism across the NBA. European big men, in particular, were considered soft, unproven, unable to handle the physicality of the American game. Nowitzki was a teenager who had never played a minute of college basketball in the United States. He was long, he was thin, and he came with no guarantees whatsoever. Traylor, by contrast, was a known quantity. He had dominated the Big Ten. He had been a McDonald's All-American. He was enormous, physical, and ready, or so Milwaukee believed, to step into an NBA rotation from day one. The Bucks thought they were getting a steal, a top 6 talent, a proven college force, handed to them because Dallas wanted to gamble on a foreign kid nobody was sure about. For Robert Traylor, though, the trade carried a different meaning entirely. On the very first night of his professional career, Before he had played a single minute, scored a single point, or grabbed a single rebound, he had already been defined. Not by who he was, but by who he was traded for. That label attached itself to him instantly, and it would never come off. And here is the detail that makes this story even more staggering. A fact that most people have completely forgotten. Pat Garrity, the other piece Dallas received in that deal? The Mavericks didn't keep him either. They flipped him to Phoenix. And who did they get in return? A Canadian point guard named Steve Nash. So, let's be absolutely clear about what flowed out of that single draft night transaction. From one trade, the trade that sent Robert Traylor to Milwaukee, the Dallas Mavericks ultimately acquired Dirk Nowitzki and the asset that became Steve Nash. Two future Hall of Famers, two MVPs, the twin pillars of a franchise that would contend for more than a decade. Nowitzki played 21 seasons in Dallas, all 21 with the same franchise. He was named an All-Star 14 times, All-NBA 12 times. He won the league's Most Valuable Player award. He won the NBA championship in 2011, defeating LeBron James and the Miami Heat, and was named Finals MVP. He retired as one of the 20 greatest scorers in the history of the sport, a player who fundamentally changed how the power forward position was played worldwide. Nash, meanwhile, won back-to-back MVP awards in 2005 and 2006, revolutionized the point guard position, and was inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame. Dave Zirin, writing in The Nation, called the Traylor for Nowitzki swap the most lopsided trade in NBA history. Sports Illustrated ranked it among the worst, and it is difficult to argue with either assessment. One side of that trade produced two of the most transformative careers in modern basketball. The other side produced Robert Traylor. But here is what nobody wanted to talk about while the comparisons were being made and the jokes were being written. Robert Traylor actually had to go out and play basketball. He had to put on a Milwaukee Bucks jersey, step onto the court, and try to build a career while carrying the heaviest label in the sport on his back. And for one season at least, it looked like he might actually do it. The 1998-99 NBA season was shortened by a lockout. Teams played just 50 games instead of 82, and the compressed schedule meant rotations were tighter. Minutes were more valuable, and every game carried extra weight. Robert Traylor stepped into that environment and earned a genuine role. He started 43 of 49 games for the Milwaukee Bucks as a rookie. A remarkable number for any first-year player, let alone one adjusting to the speed and sophistication of the professional game. He wasn't a star. He wasn't putting up all-star numbers, but he was a legitimate NBA starter, contributing minutes, rebounds, and a physical presence in the paint that Milwaukee needed. For a brief window, the narrative around the trade was at least debatable. Nowitzki, in his own rookie season, was also struggling to adjust. The German teenager looked raw, inconsistent, overwhelmed at times by the athleticism around him. There were real questions in Dallas about whether the gamble would pay off. And in Milwaukee, Traylor's early contributions gave the Bucks just enough cover to argue they hadn't made a catastrophic mistake. But that window closed fast. From that first season forward, Traylor's role shrank. The starts disappeared. The minutes dwindled. And the reason was not complicated. It was the same issue that had followed him since high school, the same concern scouts had whispered about since his days at Murray Wright, the same battle he had never been able to win. 43 starts as a rookie. It looked like the beginning of something real. But from that point forward, his role in the NBA would only move in one direction: down. And the reason wasn't just about basketball. It was about the war being fought inside his own body. Every professional athlete fights their body to some degree. Knees wear down, shoulders tear, backs seize up. That is the cost of playing a violent physical sport at the highest level. But for Robert Traylor, the fight was different. His opponent wasn't injury. It was gravity itself, the sheer relentless mass of his own frame, and the league's growing inability to accommodate it. At 290 pounds on the official roster sheet, and almost certainly heavier than that in reality, Traylor was battling something that no amount of film study or coaching could fix. The NBA was changing around him in real time. The league of the late 90s and early 2000s was getting faster, more perimeter-oriented, more dependent on athleticism and conditioning. Teams wanted big men who could run the floor, switch onto guards, and survive 40-minute games without gassing out by the third quarter. The prototype was shifting, and Traylor was moving in the opposite direction. The weight wasn't just a basketball problem, it was a perception problem. In the NBA, conditioning is treated as a proxy for character. A player who shows up to training camp heavy is a player who, in the eyes of coaches, executives, and media, doesn't care enough, doesn't work hard enough, doesn't want it badly enough. Whether that is fair or not doesn't matter. That is how the league operates. And for a man already wearing the label of the player traded for Dirk Nowitzki, every additional pound was another bullet point in the case against him. Traylor's body became the story, not his soft hands around the basket, not his rebounding instincts, not his willingness to set bone-rattling screens or absorb contact in the paint. The narrative was always the same. He was too heavy, too slow, too much of a risk. And as the seasons passed, the opportunities shrank accordingly. The 43 starts from that rookie year in Milwaukee never came back. What replaced them were shorter rotations, deeper spots on the bench, and the quiet erosion of a career that had once carried lottery pick expectations. Milwaukee, Cleveland, Charlotte, New Orleans, back to Cleveland. 5 jerseys in 7 seasons, each stop shorter than the one before, each role smaller. And then, in the summer of 2005, doctors discovered something that would reframe everything. Something far more serious than a conditioning problem. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to the NBA journeyman. You are always the new face in the locker room. You are always learning a new playbook, adjusting to a new coach's system, memorizing new teammates' tendencies. You are always auditioning, always proving yourself, and always one bad stretch away from being released. For players drafted in the lottery, men who were supposed to be franchise cornerstones, that transience carries an extra sting. After Milwaukee, Traylor moved to Cleveland for his first stint with the Cavaliers. Then Charlotte, then New Orleans, then back to Cleveland again. 438 regular season games spread across 7 seasons and 5 different team jerseys. His career averages settled at 4.8 points and 3.7 rebounds per game. Numbers that tell you he was a functional NBA player, a professional who belonged on a roster, but a universe away from what the 6th pick in a loaded draft was supposed to produce. There were nights when Traylor played well, games where his size still mattered, where he grabbed tough rebounds in traffic, or scored on a sweet hook shot that reminded people why scouts had loved him in the first place. But those nights came less frequently with each passing season. The minutes were harder to earn. The leash was shorter. Every coaching staff that gave him a chance eventually reached the same conclusion. The talent was there, but the body wouldn't cooperate. And through all of it, the comparison followed him like a second shadow. Every time Nowitzki hit a fadeaway jumper in Dallas, every all-star selection, every playoff run, each milestone from the other side of that 1998 trade made Traylor's career look smaller by contrast. He didn't ask for the comparison. He had no control over it, but he lived inside it every single day. His final NBA season ended in Cleveland in 2005. He was only 28 years old. In most careers, 28 is the doorstep of a player's prime, the years when experience and physical ability converge at their peak. But for Traylor, 28 meant something entirely different. The NBA was done with him. And what came next was not a graceful retirement. It was a medical crisis that had been building silently for longer than anyone knew. In the summer of 2005, with his final NBA season behind him, Robert Traylor underwent surgery on his aorta, the largest artery in the human body, the vessel responsible for carrying oxygenated blood from the heart to every organ, every limb, every cell. When the aorta is compromised, nothing else matters. Not basketball, not contracts, not career statistics. You are fighting for your life. The specifics of the procedure and the precise diagnosis were not widely reported at the time. What is known is that Traylor had aortic surgery during that off-season, a serious, major operation for any human being, let alone a former professional athlete carrying well over 280 pounds on a frame that had been absorbing the punishment of high-level basketball for more than a decade. For a brief moment, it looked like the surgery might offer a second chance. The New Jersey Nets signed Traylor ahead of the 2005 to 2006 season, apparently willing to bet that a healthy version of Tractor still had something to offer. But when Traylor showed up for his physical examination, he failed it. The deal was voided. Just like that, his path back to the NBA was sealed shut. Think about what that means. A team wanted him. A contract was on the table. A roster spot was waiting. And his body said no. After years of fighting his weight, after enduring the jokes and the comparisons and the slow erosion of his career, the final door didn't close because of talent or effort or desire. It closed because his heart, literally, physically, his cardiovascular system, could not pass a standard medical screening. He was 28 years old. He had earned millions of dollars. He had played 438 NBA games. And now, with a fresh surgical scar and a voided contract, he was staring at a basketball life that would have to continue, if it continued at all, far from the bright lights of the American game. When the NBA closes its doors, the game doesn't stop. It just moves to Spain, to Turkey, to Italy, to Puerto Rico, to Mexico, to leagues where the arenas are smaller, the paychecks are thinner, the crowds speak different languages, and the box scores never make American highlight shows. For players who still love the game or who still need the income, these overseas circuits offer one thing the NBA no longer will: a chance to keep playing. Robert Traylor took that chance. In 2006, he signed with Gestaberica Vigo in Spain. It was a world removed from Milwaukee and Cleveland and the Garden and the big network broadcasts, but it was basketball. He could still do the thing he had been doing since he was a teenager on the playgrounds of Detroit. From Spain, he moved to Puerto Rico, joining the Santurce Crabbers for the 2007 and 2008 seasons. Then Turkey, Antalya Kepes Belediyesi, for the 2008 to 2009 campaign. Then Italy with NSB Napoli in 2009. Then back to Puerto Rico with the Vaqueros de Bayamon, and finally to Mexico, playing for Halcones UV Salapa in 2010 and 2011. 6 countries in 5 years. A basketball odyssey that crisscrossed continents and time zones. And buried within that odyssey was a moment that almost nobody in America noticed. In 2010, playing in Puerto Rico's top professional league, the Baloncesto Superior Nacional. Traylor was named the league's Defensive Player of the Year. At 33 years old, thousands of miles from the NBA, carrying a body that had already required aortic surgery, he was still good enough, still competitive enough, still relentless enough to earn a major individual award. It was proof of something important. The talent had always been real. The toughness had always been real. Whatever else you wanted to say about Robert Traylor, the weight, the comparisons, the scandal, you could never say the man didn't love the game or couldn't play it at a high level when his body allowed. But his body was running out of time, and by the spring of 2011, in San Juan, the clock was almost at zero. There is a version of this story where Robert Traylor disappears quietly, where he fades out of professional basketball after the voided contract with New Jersey, retreats to Detroit or some other American city, and lives out his days as a forgotten former lottery pick. That version would have been easier to tell. It also would have been wrong, because Traylor refused to disappear. In 2010, playing for the Vaqueros de Bayamón in the Baloncesto Superior Nacional, Puerto Rico's premier professional basketball league, he did something that should have made headlines back in the States. He was named the league's Defensive Player of the Year. 33 years old, a man who had undergone major cardiovascular surgery 5 years earlier. A man whose weight had been the subject of jokes and front office frustration for more than a decade. And here he was, in a legitimate professional league, being recognized as the single best defensive player in the entire competition. That award tells you something no career average can. It tells you that Traylor still understood positioning, still had the instincts to anticipate where the ball was going before it got there, still possessed the sheer physical mass to wall off the paint and make opposing players think twice about driving the lane. At 33, after everything, he could still do the thing he had been doing since Murray Wright High School. He could make the area around the basket his personal territory. He also played for Halcones UV Zalapa in Mexico during the 2010 to 2011 stretch, continuing to chase the game across borders and time zones. Spain, Puerto Rico, Turkey, Italy, back to Puerto Rico, Mexico, 6 countries, half a dozen uniforms, and not once did he stop competing. But while Traylor was collecting accolades on Caribbean and Latin American courts, the past was not finished with him. Back in the United States, a federal case connected to those long-ago payments from Ed Martin had already reached its conclusion, and it had left a permanent mark. The money had seemed simple enough at the time. A booster handing cash to a college kid from Detroit, a kid who had probably never had real money in his life. Ed Martin's payments, derived from gambling proceeds, had flowed to Traylor and other Michigan players during the mid to late 90s. At 18, 19 years old, with the NBA shimmering on the horizon, those transactions might have felt like nothing more than the cost of doing business in big-time college basketball. But the federal government does not forget, and it does not forgive unpaid taxes. In January of 2007, according to reporting by ESPN, Traylor entered a guilty plea on charges of tax evasion. The case was a direct outgrowth of the Martin investigation, the same scandal that had already erased his college records, stripped his tournament MVP awards, and scarred the Michigan basketball program for a generation. 8 months later, in September of that same year, he was sentenced to 3 years of probation. No prison time, but a federal conviction, a permanent entry on his record that would follow him for the rest of his life. Consider the timing. When that guilty plea was entered, Traylor was overseas, grinding through foreign leagues, trying to extend a basketball career that the NBA had already ended. He was simultaneously fighting to stay relevant on the court and answering to a federal courtroom for money he had received as a teenager. The payments from Martin that might have felt like easy generosity a decade earlier had metastasized into a legal burden that reached across oceans: 3 years of probation. Not the harshest sentence imaginable, but for a man already carrying the weight of a voided NBA contract, aortic surgery, and the most infamous trade comparison in basketball history, it was one more thing piled onto a load that never seemed to get lighter. And yet, even after the guilty plea, even after the sentencing, Traylor kept playing basketball. He kept boarding flights to foreign countries, kept lacing up sneakers in unfamiliar gyms, kept doing the only thing that had ever made complete sense to him. The question that haunted everything was whether his body could sustain it. By 2010 and 2011, the arc of Traylor's career had bent so far from its origin that the two endpoints barely seemed connected. The 6th overall pick in a loaded draft class, a McDonald's All-American who had shared a stage with future Hall of Famers, and now a 33-year-old journeyman splitting time between Puerto Rico and Mexico, playing in front of crowds that wouldn't fill a large American high school gymnasium. But he was still playing. That fact alone is remarkable. After aortic surgery, after a federal conviction, after years of weight battles that had cost him his NBA career, after being traded on draft night for a player who became one of the greatest to ever live. After all of it, Robert Traylor still showed up, still put on the uniform, still went to work. The Defensive Player of the Year award in Puerto Rico had been a moment of late career validation, but it didn't change the physical reality. His body had been under siege for years, decades, really, going all the way back to high school, when his enormous frame had been both his greatest asset and his most dangerous liability. The cardiovascular surgery in the summer following his last NBA season had been a warning. The voided physical with New Jersey had been another. And carrying that kind of weight through tropical heat, through the grind of international schedules with less medical infrastructure than the NBA provides, was borrowing against a future that was getting shorter by the month. The Mexico stint with Halcones UV Zalapa stretched into 2011. And then, sometime in the spring, Traylor was back in Puerto Rico, the island where he had found his last real basketball success, the place where he had been recognized as one of the best defensive players in the league. He was 34 years old. Most people in America had not thought about Robert Traylor in years. If his name came up at all, it was as a footnote. The wrong side of a famous trade, a trivia question about draft night mistakes. Nobody was tracking his movements through Caribbean and Latin American basketball circuits. Nobody was asking how his heart was holding up. They were about to find out. It happened in San Juan. The details that filtered back to American media were sparse, as they so often are when a former athlete dies far from home, far from the spotlight, far from the machinery that once amplified every moment of his life. In May of 2011, Robert "Tractor" Traylor suffered what was reported as an apparent heart attack. He was 34 years old. He passed away in Puerto Rico, the same island where, just a year earlier, he had been named the best defensive player in the country's top professional league. 34. An age when most people are still building their lives. An age when former NBA players, even those whose careers ended early, are typically settling into second acts: coaching, broadcasting, business ventures, family life. Traylor never got that chance. The news traveled slowly through American sports media. There were obituaries, but they were brief. Most of them mentioned the same things: the draft, the trade, the weight, the comparison. Even in passing, the Nowitzki narrative was inescapable. It was as if his entire existence had been compressed into a single transaction on a single night in 1998. and nothing else. Not 7 NBA seasons, not 438 games, not an overseas career that spanned 6 countries, not a Defensive Player of the Year award, not aortic surgery, not a federal case, not any of it could compete with the gravity of that one trade. He had been, in life, a man defined by other people's decisions. Dallas chose him and immediately gave him away. Milwaukee expected him to justify the cost of losing Nowitzki, which no human being could have done. The NBA measured him against his body and found him wanting. The federal government measured him against his taxes and convicted him. And the basketball world measured him against a German teenager and called him the biggest mistake in draft history. What nobody measured was the cost of carrying all of that, the psychic weight on top of the physical weight, for an entire adult life. There is a particular kind of trap that the NBA sets for certain players, not with contracts or trades or roster cuts, but with narrative. Once the story is written, once the framing is locked in, nothing you do on the court can rewrite it. You can play well, play hard, play for years. It doesn't matter. The story was decided before you touched the ball. Robert Traylor lived inside that trap for his entire professional life. The math was simple, and it was merciless. On one side of the ledger, Dirk Nowitzki, a 21-year career spent entirely in Dallas. 14 All-Star selections, 12 All-NBA nods, a League MVP trophy, a Finals MVP trophy, a championship ring earned by defeating LeBron James and the Miami Heat in the biggest upset of the modern era. A player who fundamentally altered how the power forward position was understood and played across the globe. On the other side of the ledger, Robert Traylor, 438 games, 4.8 points per game, 3.7 rebounds. A career spent mostly on the bench, mostly in transition between franchises, mostly in decline. Dave Zirin, writing for The Nation, called it the most lopsided trade in NBA history. Sports Illustrated placed it among the worst. And every time those rankings were published, every time a columnist needed an easy example of front office incompetence, the same two names appeared side by side, Nowitzki and Traylor, as if they were opposing entries in a ledger that could never be balanced. But the comparison was always built on a lie. Traylor wasn't traded because he lacked talent. He was traded because Dallas wanted someone else and used him as currency to get there. He was a means to an end. A chip slid across the table on draft night by executives who had already made their decision before his name was called. He had no say in the transaction, no vote, no veto. He walked to the stage as the 6th overall pick and sat back down as a punchline, and the distance between those two identities was measured in seconds. The cruelty of draft night trades is that they assign blame to the wrong person. Milwaukee made the deal. Milwaukee chose Traylor over Nowitzki. But it was Traylor, not the executives, not the scouts, not the coaching staff, who wore the consequences for the rest of his life. Every article mentioned it. Every broadcast reference included it. Even his obituaries led with it. He was never allowed to simply be a basketball player. He was always the man they traded for Dirk. The trade defined him in life. But after his passing, a different conversation began. Not about basketball transactions, but about what happens to a human being when the only story anyone tells about them is someone else's success. If the trade stole his NBA identity, the NCAA sanctions erased his college one. Because of the violations connected to Ed Martin's payments, the university vacated every game record in which Robert Traylor participated. Every win, every stat line, every box score. Officially, in the eyes of the governing body that oversees college athletics, those games never happened. The NIT championship in '97, gone. The inaugural Big Ten tournament title in '98 gone. Those 16.2 points and 10.1 rebounds per game during his best season, struck from the books as if he had never set foot on the court. Both of his postseason MVP awards were forfeited. The trophies he earned, the tangible physical proof that he had been the best player on the floor in 2 separate tournament fields, were taken back. Not because he had played poorly, not because the results were disputed, but because money had changed hands years earlier. Money he received as a teenager. Money from a booster whose gambling-derived payments would eventually trigger a federal investigation and tear apart one of the most prominent basketball programs in the country. Chris Webber's Michigan legacy suffered similarly. But Webber had a long, successful NBA career to serve as a counterweight. All-star appearances, big contracts, national visibility that kept his name relevant independent of what happened in Ann Arbor. Traylor had no such counterweight. His college record was erased. His professional career was defined by someone else's brilliance. His tax case left a federal conviction on his permanent record. Layer by layer, almost everything he had built was either taken away or reframed as evidence of failure. There is a word for what happened to Robert Traylor's legacy, and it is not forgotten. Forgotten implies that people once remembered and then stopped. What happened to Traylor was closer to erasure, a systematic removal of accomplishment from every phase of his career, until what remained was a nickname, a trade, and a cautionary tale. His records wiped clean, his trade a permanent asterisk, his body breaking down in foreign gyms thousands of miles from home. But even in that bleak accounting, there were people who knew the real Robert Traylor. Teammates, coaches, opponents, and after he was gone, some of them tried to say what the headlines never had. When a former professional athlete dies at 34, the tributes come quickly, and they reveal, almost always, the gap between the public narrative and the private person. The public narrative around Robert Traylor had been fixed for years. A cautionary tale, a draft bust, the wrong side of a historic mistake. But the people who actually shared locker rooms with him, who practiced alongside him, who competed against him night after night, told a different story. They talked about a man who was generous, who was funny, who filled a room with his personality in the same way he filled a lane with his body. They talked about a teammate who showed up and worked, even when the minutes dried up and the spotlight moved on. They talked about a competitor who never stopped loving the game, even when the game seemed to have stopped loving him back. The basketball world took notice of his passing, however briefly. Former teammates and opponents posted messages. Coaches offered condolences. The Milwaukee Bucks, the franchise that had traded for him on that famous draft night, acknowledged his passing publicly. But the tributes were small, and they faded quickly. The news cycle moved on within days. There were playoff games to cover, free agency rumors to chase, draft boards to update. The machinery of professional basketball does not pause for long, not even for a man who had once been its 6th overall selection. What lingers, for those who care to look, is the disconnect. The version of Traylor that existed in headlines, overweight, overhyped, traded for a legend, bore almost no resemblance to the version that existed in person. The headlines never captured the broken backboard, the late career defensive award, the 6 countries he played in after the NBA shut its doors, the fact that he kept competing long after most men in his position would have walked away. The headlines never captured the human being. They only captured the transaction. Robert Deshaun Traylor was born in Detroit on the 1st of February, 1977, and he passed away in Puerto Rico 34 years later. Between those 2 points, He lived a life that contained more than any single trade, any single scandal, or any single number on a scale could ever summarize. He was a McDonald's All-American who stood alongside future legends and was considered their equal. He was a college force who shattered a backboard and won tournament MVP awards that were later stripped from him by forces beyond his control. He was a lottery pick who was given away before he played a minute. He was a rookie who started 43 games and looked for one brief season like the real thing. He was a journeyman who crossed 5 NBA cities and never found a permanent home. He was an overseas professional who earned a top defensive honor on a Caribbean island, proving at 33 that the talent had never been the problem. He was a man who had aortic surgery and kept playing. He was a man who pleaded guilty in a federal courtroom and kept playing. He was a man who carried 300 pounds and the worst comparison in basketball history on the same frame, and he kept playing until his heart could not take it anymore. The NBA draft is a machine that creates winners and losers in a single evening. It assigns value, manufactures narratives, and locks young men into stories they did not write and cannot escape. Robert Traylor was locked into his story on June the 24th, 1998, the moment Dallas called his name with no intention of keeping him. Everything that followed, the weight battles, the shrinking minutes, the overseas exile, the scandal, the surgery, the passing, was lived in the shadow of that single transaction. He deserved better than to be remembered only as the other side of a trade. He was more than a punchline. He was more than a contrast. He was a basketball player who loved the game enough to chase it across 6 countries and never quit. And he was a human being whose body gave out long before his will did. Robert Tractor Traylor, 6th pick, 1998, 438 games, 6 countries. One of the best defensive players in a Caribbean league at 33. Gone at 34. Remember the man, not just the trade,